Hello and welcome to my video about multi-booting. Following my last video, Getting Linux Mint, it was pointed out in the comments that there is a fourth way of getting Linux Mint while still keeping Windows installed on your computer too. This is called multi-booting or dual booting. I didn't go into it on that video because it's gotten a bit more complicated than it once was, and I really wanted to keep the series as simple as possible. However, for completeness, I shall go over in this video a brief history about multi-booting itself and a few ways that you could maybe get multi-booting working on your computer at home. Multi-booting is a method of having one or more operating systems installed on one computer at a time. When I say installed, it doesn't mean that you can run one or more at the same time. What it means is that you can choose which one you wish to boot when you start up the computer. For example, if you booted into Windows and then needed to use Linux, you'd have to close everything down in Windows, restart the computer, and then choose Linux from the boot menu. If you think this sounds cumbersome, that's because it is. However, once upon a time, if you needed more than one operating system and you only had one computer, this was the way that you would do it. Nowadays, we've got another option in virtual machines. They're not perfect, and dual booting still has its place, but they've taken away a lot of the need for dual boot. Virtual machines allow us to have one main operating system, known as the host operating system, and then lots of guest operating systems running on top of what was known as a hypervisor, which basically allows a load of virtual hardware that runs on top of your computer. This takes up a certain amount of RAM and CPU and hard disk space, but for most computers in the modern day, they've got more than enough to run a couple of VMs, as they're known for short, without any problem. And the other nice thing is you don't have to shut down your computer to boot into the other type of operating system, and very often the virtual machine hypervisor even has tools that allows you to copy and paste files to and from as easy as right click and paste. So really they are leaps and bounds better in many ways. The only problem is they tend to virtualize the hardware, and it's not always possible or easy to pass, say, a graphics card through to the operating system if you needed one, or a USB stick. It can be done, but it's not always as easy or as slick as it could be, and for that reason, multi-booting's still got its place. So why would anyone need more than one operating system to begin with? Well, for starters, there's people that do testing. So IT testers often need to test against more than one operating system to make sure that programs work on every platform that they need to. Secondly, you might find that you've got a program, old or new, that works on one version of Windows, for example, but doesn't work on a newer version. Alternatively, you might be trying to switch from one operating system to another, but you haven't quite got all your programs working in the other version. For example, if you want to switch to Linux, you might find that you've still got a few programs that depend on Windows, and for that reason having both versions installed makes it possible for you to make the switch. Back in the late 80s and 90s, if you wanted to run more than one operating system on one computer, you only really had dual booting or multi-booting as an option. Virtual machines weren't really where they are today, and you'd be lucky enough to have the hardware to support them, especially if you were a home user. By 1999, common versions of Windows you'd find floating around would be Windows 98, Windows 98 SE, Windows 95, and then you've got the professional line, you've got Windows NT 4.0 and Windows 2000. And that's not to mention the older versions which didn't have the start bar and DOS. Imagine if you're a software tester back then, that's a lot of operating systems you need to verify that software works on. Very often, especially for games, if you looked on the back of the box, there's a long list of Windows operating systems which was verified to work on, and someone had to test that, and multi-booting is one such way that it was achieved. Linux was also starting to become much bigger in the desktop scene at this time. One of the ways that they tried to encourage people to install it was to install it alongside Windows, and they made this as easy as they possibly could. Another example was going back to when IBM still made PCs. After their breakup with Microsoft, they started making their own operating system, OS/2, but to be able to help sell it, they also offered dual booting with MS-DOS or possibly even Windows. And how could we forget Apple's Boot Camp, the program that allowed you to run Windows and Mac simultaneously on the same computer? Apple computer to be precise. This was made possible in the mid-noughties when Apple decided to switch from using PowerPC processors to Intel processors, which meant that all of a sudden, the Apple computers were compatible with the Microsoft software. Boot Camp was a way of making it very easy to switch between Mac and Windows. Of course, you still had to reboot to switch between them, but they made it as seamless as possible. This probably helped Apple shift a couple more computers for those users switching over who still wanted Windows for a few things. Quite possibly inspired by this, Canonical, the Linux company responsible for producing Ubuntu Linux, created a program called Wooby. This allowed you to choose which version of Linux you'd like to be installed, and it'd install it as simple as installing any other program on Windows. And then of course you could uninstall it as well. However, due to modern hardware moving on and applying new security practices, this no longer works. And this brings me on to why I think multi-booting these days is really something more for advanced users. To try and stop malicious software from executing at the point that your computer starts up, this is something that's often referred to as rootkits, a technology was developed called Secure Boot. Now this is a good thing in practice, however it depends how it's implemented, and the way it's been implemented works really well for Microsoft, but it doesn't work so well for anybody else. The vast majority of PCs are designed for Windows, and so that the manufacturers are allowed to stick the little designed for Windows or compatible with Windows sticker on that computer, they have to meet some criteria from Microsoft themselves. Microsoft stipulates that Secure Boot must be available and installed, and this is fine. The thing is, Secure Boot works by using certificates, and certificates indicate trust, if you like. So they install the certificate allowing the trust from Microsoft, because that's what they've been asked to do, and that's probably what their users are going to use, and they don't bother installing it from anybody else. This means you can install almost any compatible version of Windows on that computer and have Secure Boot enabled with relative ease. However, if you want to install Linux on there, you've got to allow the installation to also inject the correct certificates into the UEFI BIOS on the computer, which is often more difficult than it should be. And this is the first reason why I think multi-booting these days is more something for advanced users. However, I should point out that this can also confuse the setup process if you're only installing Linux on that computer too. Sometimes, depending on how the computer's being configured from the manufacturer, it can be a little bit difficult booting from, say, a USB stick with the correct installation files. And even if you can, depending on how Secure Boot's being configured, it might not let you in the first place. Again, this is an obstacle you might have to overcome if you're simply wanting to install Linux instead of Windows on the computer anyway. However, it's just another hurdle that you have to sort out when you're trying to do multi-booting. The final gotcha that I'll talk about today is, say you've managed to boot up into the setup for Linux and you're trying to install it alongside Windows, but you happen to be using one of those computers that was built in between the switch between Secure Boot and the legacy boot. You can end up in a situation where the setup won't recognise that you've got Windows already installed. This is quite possibly because you've got Windows installed using the newer Secure Boot, but you've booted the installer using the legacy boot. This means that the setup is looking for a legacy bootloader on the hard drive and it can't find it, therefore assuming that there's nothing there it can work with. As a result, it's very likely to give you the option to wipe the hard drive and install Linux, but not the option to install Linux alongside Windows, which is probably what you wanted. You can go back to the boot options page in the BIOS and see if there's an option for a UEFI Secure Boot to the installer, but there's no guarantee that it's going to be there, depending on the model of computer. This particular scenario was most common on computers which were shipped with later versions of Windows 7 through to about Windows 8. By the time Windows 10 came out, this particular teething issue seems to have been resolved. With all of this in mind, if you are considering dual booting your computer with anything other than Windows, or even if you are considering dual booting with Windows, I highly recommend that you back up your files first, preferably the entire computer, because there is a chance that it could go wrong. And to be clear, there is no undo button. You could end up with a wiped hard drive. So how does dual booting actually work? What it does is it adds what we call a partition to your hard drive. So Using free space available, it creates a new partition separate to the one that your operating system and files are stored in, and it creates a fresh one for the new operating system. Once the new operating system has been installed in that partition, an entry is added to the bootloader so that you can choose which operating system you want to start when you start up your computer. All the operating systems installed work completely independently of each other, though you may be able to browse the files. This is handy if you wanted to, say, grab a document from Windows and then edit it in Linux. I shall now do a quick demonstration of how you can install Linux alongside Windows. However, you should note that the process of at least booting the installer can vary from computer to computer, so don't use this as an exact instruction. You should be able to Google how to get the boot options for your particular computer if you can find the manufacturer and model number and then search for that in Google, or whichever search engine you prefer. I'm going to use a virtual machine for this demonstration, however the process is very similar for physical hardware. You will need to download the installation ISO of whichever operating system that you wish, then either burn it to a CD or flash it to a USB stick using a program such as Rufus. If you're not sure how to do this, check out my videos or anyone else's on YouTube. There's loads of them explaining exactly how to do this for almost every operating system you could want. In my example, I'm going to install Linux Mint alongside Windows 11. Here is my Windows 11 computer. I shall now restart it to begin the installation of Linux Mint. This is where you'll need to know which key to press to bring up the boot menu on your computer. Very often this is F12 and it needs to be pressed just as the computer's booting up. From the boot menu, you then need to select the device that the installation files are on, for example the CD drive or USB stick that you're using. Bear in mind that the names of these will vary wildly from computer to computer. We're then presented with the boot menu for the installer. I've selected the first option to start Linux Mint. This will then give me the option to install it. The loading screen will then show. This may take a few moments to boot depending on the speed of the installation media that you're using. If you're using a CD, this can take quite some time. Once loaded, I can double click on the icon on the desktop to begin the Linux Mint installation. This also can take a few moments to load. To begin with, choose your language and keyboard layout. This is the first screen we need to take real attention to. You need to check the install multimedia codecs, not just because they're handy to have for playing back music and so on, but because it also allows us to then configure secure boot. This is the first step to getting the required certificates into the UEFI BIOS so that the Linux bootloader is trusted. All you need to do is set a password and remember it for the duration of the setup. This is not the password that you'll be using to log onto the computer, but rather the password that you'll be using to install the certificates into the computer. Next, you'll be asked what type of installation you'd like to do. In this case, we want to install Linux Mint alongside the Windows bootloader. If you haven't got this option, turn back because your only other option is to wipe the entire hard drive and install Linux Mint only on it, and that isn't what we're wanting to do here. Then you'll be asked how much of the free space you'd like to allocate to Linux Mint and how much you want to be available to Windows. Alternatively, from the select drive, you can choose to install it to a completely different hard disk if you have one available. Use the slider to choose how much space is available to each operating system. You'll then be asked to confirm the changes that you'll be making to the hard drive. You may need to wait a moment or two whilst the setup makes the changes to your disk. This will vary depending on the number of files that you have and the type of storage that you're using. Then we're back to the typical operating system setup questions such as which region are you in and what user information do you want to specify. It is on this screen that you set the password that you'll use to log into the computer. The setup will then take its time to install Linux Mint. I will be fast forwarding this process. That's the first step of the installation done. We now need to restart the computer to continue with the next bit. Remove the CD or USB used to install Linux Mint and press enter. Now we get to the bit of the setup where we need to install the keys into the firmware of the computer. This is where you'll require that first password that you set during the setup. Press the down arrow key once to select Enroll Mock, and then press the enter key. Press the down arrow key followed by enter again to continue, and do the same to select yes. Type in the password that you set earlier and press enter. Then press enter again to reboot the computer. This is the computer's boot menu, which will now let you choose between Linux Mint or Windows. You've got the option to boot Linux Mint at the top, and third from the bottom, the Windows Boot Manager, which will let you boot Windows. You can use the arrow keys followed by enter to choose which option you wish to boot. It is possible to customize the screen, however this won't be covered in this video. There is a timer on this menu, and if it expires it will just boot the default option, which in this case is Linux Mint. Enter the logon password that you created during setup for the user, and you're into Linux Mint. Now let's say that we needed something in Windows. We can restart, choose the Windows Boot Manager, and Windows will boot. And there you have it, a multi-boot computer. More often than not, it isn't too complicated to do, provided you know how to install the secure boot keys. It's just every now and again you got a computer that doesn't always play very nicely with dual boot, and for that reason I only really recommend it to the more confident users. That said, if you've got a computer that's old enough not to have secure boot, you'll find that those steps aren't in the installer and it is a lot more straightforward. I hope you found this video helpful, and thanks for watching.